Easy D6 is a rules-lite RPG written and designed by YouTube's DM Scotty, or Scotty McFarland, illustrated by Sean Bova, and published under Brandish Gilhelm's Runehammer Games, the creator of Index Card RPG. Basically, it's the ultimate RPG if you're looking for a classic D&D fantasy-themed game, but either have players who don't want to learn a bunch of rules, or have players who want to drink a lot of beer while playing and don't want to remember a lot of rules. The game bills itself as, quote, a fast-moving game of fantasy mayhem, and that's about as accurate as any statement. The biggest thing worth noting about this game, and why it stands out among the sea of rules-lite RPGs out there that try to pare down D&D to the bone, or even suck its marrow out of those bones and just serve you the marrow, is that the author playtested this game for 2 years at conventions and elsewhere, and garnered a following who also playtested this game. Scotty started with the familiar premise of trying to make something that focused more on faster, smoother fun, and he ruthlessly cut and changed the rules for 2 years until maximum fun was achieved. You can get this game on DriveThruRPG in PDF, or print on demand softcover or hardcover. It runs about 110 pages, but the rules only comprise about 20 of those pages. The rest is a GM section, a monster list, and some cheat sheets for running the game. This video is sponsored by Tabletop.Land, a tabletop gaming marketplace consisting of vendors just like you. It's a mom and pop shop inspired by the idea of, what should I do with all this leftover terrain and minis after my game ends? Come find everything from castles to sci-fi power plants, scatter terrain to pre-painted minis, or unpainted 3D printed ones. You can even find partial terrain such as foam lumber or bricks to speed up the process of building your own. That's tabletop.land. The links are down below. Here's how it works. By the way, in this game the GM is called the Rabble Rouser and the PCs are called Pushers and Shovers. Everyone is rolling usually 1 to 3 d6s in order to meet or exceed a target number. Sometimes the dice pool goes up to 4, 5, or 6 depending on a variety of factors. There are no character stats. Instead, most differentiation between characters and difficulties are swayed by boons and banes, which you may know as the advantage system from D&D 5e. For example, with boons, if you're trained in a particular task or something, you get to roll 2 d6s instead of 1 and keep the higher roll. With banes, you keep the lower of the 2. What's interesting is that boons and banes stack. So if you have accumulated 2 boons on a particular check, for example, you would actually roll 3 dice and take the best of them. Rolling a 1 on any roll is always going to be a failure, and a 6 is always a success. It's important to note here that if you roll a 1 and a 6 on the same regular roll, the 6 takes precedence and the 1 is ignored. Anyway, the game makes heavy use of meta currency to keep the fun going. The first of these 2 forms that it comes in is the hero die. Everyone gets 1 hero die at the beginning of the session, and they can burn it to roll any 1 die, even a 1. You can buy back your spent hero die by spending 5 karma. Karma is a point pool, and everyone starts with 3 points. Anytime a PC fails a check, they get a karma point. And they can also be awarded karma for good roleplay and whatever the Rabble Rouser thinks is appropriate. Aside from buying back your hero die, you can also spend 1 karma to add +1 to any 1 rolled die. This is the single most generous application of meta currency I think I've ever come across, by the way. Again, it comes from tons of one-shot and casual play where the objective is just to offer the players as many bursts of dopamine as possible. To be fair, there are a couple of limitations to the karma points. You can't use them on magic or miracle rolls, and you can't spend them on a rolled 1. But still. Turn economy is interesting. All PCs go first, and then all enemies go. Players decide on their order. On a player's turn during combat, they get a move, a turn action, and a free action. They can delay their turn in order to interrupt an enemy's turn, but at the cost of not being able to run or use a free action. As you might expect, distances in this game are pretty hand-wavy. Anything within 30 feet is considered near, anything beyond 30 feet is considered far. Every PC starts with 3 to 5 hit points called strikes. I tried to see how strikes could be any different from hit points, but really, they're hit points. Anyway, 1 hit equals 1 strike of damage. Normal-sized weapons like daggers, clubs, swords, and even great swords inflict 1 strike. To inflict 2 strikes, you need to bring out the ballistas and the dragon fire. Recovering strikes can be done with magic, or you can get 1 back with a meal and a night of rest. Ultimately, this hit point economy is actually pretty brutal, depending on how forgiving the rabble-rouser wants to be when a character reaches 0 strikes. Probably the single biggest factor for chaotic swingy play in this game is the fact that the dice explode on to hit rolls, meaning if you roll a 6 when checking to see if your attack hits, you get to re-roll that 6 to see if you earned another hit, and rolling a 6 again would allow another roll ad infinitum. Furthermore, if you kill 1 creature but you still have an extra strike left, you can use it on any other creature that's in range of your weapon. Here's the crazy thing. You can use karma points to bump dice rolls up to a 6, thereby artificially creating a monumental dice explosion at least once or twice per session. Deadliness does come in another form for players aside from monster attacks. Things like falling, fire, crushing rocks, or extreme monster attacks will trigger a so-called miraculous save, or basically a saving throw, where the player needs to meet or beat a target number or suffer a strike for every failed roll. Casting magic in the game employs a competing dice pool system. First, the player comes up with whatever spell they want and describe what they want it to do. Then they choose the spell's power level, 1, 2, or 3d6. Then the rabble-rouser will roll 1 or more resistance dice. Okay, so for example, my Shadow Weaver wants to cast an attack spell on a Greeblix. The spell's description is completely up to me. In terms of the game's rules, the nature of the spell hardly matters. What matters is the power level I choose for the spell, which I won't choose until after the target's resistance has been rolled. The Greeblix has a listed magic resistance of 3d6, and resistance is always rolled first. So this Greeblix has a 1, 4, and 5 for rolled resistance. I need to meet or beat that 5, so I will choose 2d6 as my power level for the spell. I get a 1 and a 5. According to the rules, a 1 on a casting roll will always mean the spell fails, which should be considered when you are choosing a higher power level for the spell. The more dice you roll, the higher the chance you'll get that 1 and ruin the whole cast. Casters also have the option of taking a strike of damage to force the spell to cast successfully. Divine magic, called miracles in this game, work just a little differently. The players still come up with their spell, or miracle in this case, completely on their own, but the resistance comes from the GM directly. They determine how aloof the god being prayed to is and roll 1 to 6 dice as resistance. Miracles cannot be used to harm another or cause damage, and can only be used once per scene. And like magic spells, a rolled 1 will always end the cast. Characters in the game are composed of their path, species, and inclination, basically. These things determine what class of armor they can wear, which tasks they can always apply boons to, like proficiencies in D&D, and some special abilities. This warrior path actually has the wordiest abilities descriptions of them all. But as you can see, most of the paths have very short and to the point descriptions. The Friar's Holy Light ability is relatively wordy as well, but I mean, compared to most RPGs out there, this is still pretty concise. The species you choose here gives you either an extra inclination or an extra ability. Inclinations are selected from a list of 30. Humans start with 3, and the other species, due to having their own little special abilities, start with 2. These inclinations are where you'll see the baseline rules of the game getting knocked around and bent a little bit, and it's probably the most fun part of character building. Finally, you choose 2 aspects, which are narrative descriptors to add some dimension to your character. Actually, if one of your aspects comes into play in a dice roll, you gain a boon on that roll. If you've chosen a casting path for your character, you would then choose one of 10 circles of sorcery. Each of these give you default spells and deepen the mechanics on spell burn and other aspects of casting. Just like with a lot of sword and sorcery type games, whether they're rules light or rules heavy, your most interesting choices and mechanics are going to be found in the magic spells. As far as encumbrance rules, there aren't any. You carry as much as would make sense, and if the rabble-rouser isn't checking your character sheet and you want to hand wave it yourself, the sky is the limit. The GM section of the book is a solidly packed 12 or so pages, but the most notable bit out of all of this are Scotty's pro tips. He has been on YouTube for years and years sharing tabletop crafting tips, and I've personally been inspired many times by his creativity and ingenuity in that space. So it was a treat to see so much of his wisdom regarding using tabletop terrain distilled into one page. I won't read through all of it here, but if you've ever tried building or 3D printing a bunch of terrain for your game, you need to read this page and take it as gospel. Another noteworthy thing in terms of the game's rules is mentioned here. There are no experience points or levels. So the Rabble Rouser rewards players with magic items, narrative elements like land, title, and acquisitions, or maybe a second permanent hero die. You can kind of tell here that the game was forged in the context of convention-style one-shot play. There are 40 monsters statted in the book, half of them straight out of old D&D, and the other half more exotic and exclusive to this Easy D6 fantasy tome. In any given monster description, you're given some deliciously short bullet points, as well as number of hit points or strikes and a to-hit value, meaning the Rabble Rouser needs to roll this number or higher when attacking a PC in order to land a hit. The Easy D6 monsters are really interesting, although the section starts with an unusually long and wordy one called the Beast. I don't really want to show you all the monsters in this section because the discovery of novel monsters by players is one of the main joys of this kind of RPG, and I don't really want to spoil it. It's worth noting that these simple, mostly non-numerical monster descriptions are very appealing. I think one of the biggest drags on the whole OSR movement is that anything that wants to be OSR compatible will find itself shackled to blocks of boring, useless numbers in the monster's stat block. But I guess that's what the O in OSR stands for. It's worth a quick note that the end of the book has about 10 pages of cheat sheets and tables that recap all the rules and offer resources for a GM. Actually, a lot of the stuff at the end here isn't discussed previously in the book, so you actually are reading it for the first time here, and it's actually all very helpful. You definitely get the sense that this game was battle tested and a lot of play hours were distilled into these final pages. Alright, here are my thoughts on Easy D6. Completely bonkers. With a game so inclined towards chaotic fun, what with the two forms of metacurrency, the boons and the banes all over the place, and the exploding to hit dice, you're just not going to get into deep storytelling, at least not by default. It would be interesting to see a hack of the rules where instead of combat, the mechanics all served wacky social encounters instead, just to see what kind of game emerged from that. But that is not this. This game is specifically engineered for gonzo, heroic chaos. Simple but deep. The rules of the game really only run 20 pages of large, amply spaced text, but there is still complexity introduced later in the game. The inclinations give your character some interesting tilts on the rules, and the circles of sorcery are all pretty varied. Finally, and most importantly, the way that some of the monsters fight and behave. And let's face it, that's where the rubber hits the road with this game's rules, fighting. Many of the monster tactics are interesting and varied right out of the box. Artwork. Sean Bova's illustrations hit the exact right tone of having that one old school black and white style, while also having an air of cartooniness to some of them, which I think matches the tone of the game itself. So here's what I saw with DM Scotty. He was a guy going to game conventions for years, running his game over and over, dozens or hundreds of times, trying to provide people with a good time. When someone like that then publishes their game and puts all of their wisdom in a book, you automatically have to jump on it and read it cover to cover. And in this case, Easy D6 delivers on its promise. It's built for speed and fun at the expense of realism and campaign play. One of the greatest things about this game and games with fewer rules like this is that they attract a community who prioritize the gaming experience rather than affirming a game's rules or lore. I've found that the more rules a game has, and the more exact that the lore is defined, the more likely you are to find pedantic rules hounds and Jeff Albertsons in that game's community forums. But with a game like Easy D6, people are more likely to just be discussing their rules hacks and describing what kind of fun things happened at their table. I like those communities. Anyway, that's all I have for now. If you would like to keep this channel alive, please consider joining my Patreon, where I offer some behind the scenes and other more off the cuff content. And as mentioned, you can find Easy D6 on Drive-Thru RPG. All the links are down below. Thanks for watching. See ya.